The Munich Security Conference. What are some of the major issues on the agenda? Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. Leaders, diplomats and representatives from around the world have gathered in Munich for its major annual security conference. The meetings are taking place at a time of significant global tensions and challenges over how to resolve ongoing conflicts. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is attending, and for more on what he's had to say, we begin with this report from CGTN's Zhao Yunfei.
As the Munich Security Conference convenes in the shadow of uncertainties brought by changing world landscapes, China is stepping forward with its solutions. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi delivered remarks Friday in support of a system that respects all.
Will multipolarity bring chaos, conflict and confrontation? Does it mean domination by major countries and the strong bullying the weak? China's answer is we should work for an equal and orderly multipolar world.
Wang, also a member of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China Central Committee, said China is a source of certainty in a multipolar system and a constructive force. Wang Yi says China has been advocating equal treatment among countries, respecting international rule of law and practicing multilateralism.
中国，我们是在现行
China is a beneficiary of the existing order. So what China is doing, or will do, is to move the order to a more just and reasonable direction to meet most countries' expectations.
One way to do that, according to an expert in Munich, is to seek common development.
And especially he mentioned that the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Gateway Initiative of Europe should collaborate. And this is our approach, to have triangular trade and collaboration from Europe and China to develop, for example, Africa or the Middle East, to have development.
Multipolarization is indeed the theme of this year's Munich Security Conference, so there's much discussion here on the topic. China's view is that there is a way to foster multipolarization in a way that brings global peace and stability. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Munich.
And for more now, joining us from Munich is Wang Huiyao. He is founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. Also joining the discussion is Anton Fedyashin. He is a professor of history at American University. With us too is Pieter Cleppe. He is editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport EU, and here in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Pieter Kuznick. He is a professor of history at American University. Welcome to all of you to the show. Wang Huiyao, let me start with you. You know, as I said, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he addressed the conference in Munich. He stressed the importance of equality and order in a multipolar world. What can you tell us about his message and the Chinese perspective at this conference?
Thank you. Yes. I think that Foreign Minister Wang Yi actually today addressed the Munich Security Conference is a really highly expected, because this year the Munich Security Conference, actually the theme of the year is the multipolarity and how that we can sustain this disrupted war. So I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi actually gave a great assurance to the world that China is still stick to the international UN system. China is really practice multilateralism. China is actually still pursue a win-win solution. China is actually a great supporter of global systems such as UN. He actually exactly mentioned China, contribute 20% of UN budget. You know, I was among the audience. I saw what Foreign Minister Wang Yi has emphasized, and also get a great attention from the conference, because his speech was really a sharp contrast with what previously U.S. Vice President Vance's speech. Vance was there largely, talking about all the other things not really highly related to the security. So I think people are really in doubt, and then in this time of really uncertainty, I think Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's speech gave a very strong, actually, assurance to the global community that China still sticks to those multipolar system, and China is actually play a constructive role, and China is going to continue to support this global multilateralism through initiatives like a Belt and Road, and he even calls for collaboration between China's Belt and Road and EU's EU Global Gateway, and of course win-win position for all development with other countries as well.
Anton Fedyashin, one of the big issues discussed at this conference is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Russia is not at the conference, I should mention that. On Friday, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, they held a meeting with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Are you hopeful that there could be some progress on the way towards resolving this conflict?
Anand, it looks like there will be some progress. Unfortunately, it may not involve the Europeans if they choose to become obstacles to it. And Vladimir Zelensky is going to be forced to the negotiating table, whether he likes it or not, because he will simply have no other choice. This is unfortunate for Ukraine, but then again, they blew past multiple off-ramps as the whole Ukraine crisis started developing all the way back in 2014. Now, what shape this is going to take is still an open question. We've all, those of us who have been watching what's going on in Europe, were witnessing a collective nervous breakdown today because President Trump and President Putin had a phone call, but they've made no agreements. They will be talking about a broad range of things they already had during the phone call, and Ukraine was not the only one. There were discussions about the dollar, about oil prices, about the Middle East, about a whole slew of questions in which Russia and the United States have common interests and which they can really both profit from working on. But they both agree that the Ukrainians will have to be part of the ultimate solution. So nothing horrible has happened yet, but the worst nonetheless is ahead, because the settlement will be taking place on Russia's terms for the most part, simply because of the situation on the battlefield right now. There's no chance that Ukraine will win. The carrot of NATO that the Biden administration constantly dangled in front of the Ukrainians is not coming. And so these will be very, very tough negotiations. But the sooner they begin, the better, or the less worse, I should say, the outcome will be for Ukraine.
Pieter Cleppe in Brussels. Of course, this conflict is a major security concern for Europe. As Anton told us, the Europeans are not altogether happy about the way things are turning out right now. This is a peace effort that is largely being driven by the United States. How are European leaders viewing it?
Well, indeed, European leaders are not happy that they are basically being ignored by Trump, who's going over their heads, directly talking to Putin, ignoring all the previous strategies to refuse to talk to Putin. On the one hand, people sort of agree that the outlines of the compromise are probably what could be expected, which is that Ukraine would lose part of the territory that Putin had been stealing from them, firstly, and that Ukraine would ultimately not become a member of NATO. But much of the criticism, and also not just in Europe, also in the US, is, why are you already making concessions at the beginning of the negotiation? You should be making concessions at the end. Now, I do think the jury is out on that. We'll have to see if ultimately this appeared to be the wisest decision. But indeed, Europe is being ignored. And I would say the main reason for it is actually unrelated to Trump. It's because Europe has been, and European governments, especially Germany, have been ignoring their defense capacity for decades. They have been relying on the United States, so it's only normal that now the big decisions are being taken in Washington, D.C.
Pieter Kuznick, How do you view this U.S. approach now under President Trump compared to the Biden team? Because the Biden team's approach was to pour lots of money, lots of arms into Ukraine. I mean, do you see a potential solution here?
I see a potential solution, but the difference is like night and day. And Biden was really the one who rallied the Europeans, rallied NATO in support of Ukraine. And he thought very highly of alliances. Trump has a very, very different approach. You know, Trump does not value alliances in the same way. Trump's focus is not on Ukraine at this point. Trump, Hegseth said the other day that we want to get over Ukraine so we can focus more on China, who the Trump team sees as much more of a threat to American security. They also talk about needing to focus more on the southern and northern borders of the United States. So their sense of security is very, very different. Their priorities are very different, but some good might come of it. As bad as Trump is when it comes to domestic policy, and I consider him to be a fascist in U.S. domestic policy, and as bad as he is in terms of Gaza and the Pacific, he's actually can probably advance the cause of peace between Russia and Ukraine in a way, certainly, that the Biden team was not able to do. So I'm optimistic about that, but I'm very pessimistic about the rest of what he represents.
All right, Pieter Kuznick, you know, you say some good might come out of it, but there are those, especially in Europe, who say, look, what Trump is doing right now is selling out Ukraine.
Well, if stopping the killing of Ukrainians and the destruction of their economy is selling them out, then maybe we need some selling them out. You know, Ukraine is in a very, very difficult position. Ukraine is outmanned, outgunned, outmaneuvered, outstrategized, and if we delay the resolution 6 months from now, a year from now, and then they finally negotiate, Russia will control more of Ukraine than it controls now. It'll be even more strongly in the driver's seat. So I don't see a positive alternative for Ukraine. And if they've got to be dragged to the negotiating table, I mean, they definitely have to be at the negotiating table.
Right.
There have to be some security guarantees given that they're comfortable with, even though Hegseth says the United States is not going to be involved in that. And he says Europe has really got to step up on this. But in the long run, I believe it's in Ukraine's best interest.
Wang Huiyao, you know, China is a very strong advocate for international law, for diplomacy, for dialogue. I mean, how important is that approach in resolving something like this Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Absolutely. I think that China actually, stands firm on promoting the peace and, of course, also promoting the negotiations and dialogue. I mean, also the theme of the Munich Security Conference this year is a peace through dialogue, which is so crucial that we have to dialogue and stop the war. I think China has been doing that for consistently. Actually, I saw the Munich Security Chairman had a dialogue with Foreign Minister Wang Yi today on the spot, which mentioned about Wang Yi said 3 years ago when the war broke out, and actually China respects sovereignty and territorial integrity, and Ukraine is no exception. So this is a very strong stand from China, and also China actually had a stand that no nuclear war should be fought in Ukraine, and Chinese president has talked to both Putin and Zelensky. So I think China has really played a very significant role now. China is the largest trading partner for both Ukraine and Russia, and China can exercise huge influence, of course, by saying that this war should not be fought. This nuclear war should not be fought. There's a strong message there, and also furthermore, and President Trump has said, you know, if U.S. and China works together, nothing in the world cannot be solved. So I think that China also wants peace, and also it's in China's interest to have the peace because China is the largest trading partner of 140 countries. China doesn't want the war to be disrupted, also the price of energy to be disrupted, and China has actually a very strong stand to want to see this happen. So for this solution, China could be playing more role like a guarantor, like with China, with India, or if the Trump said that they want to send peacekeeping force by German, French, and Polish, I don't think Putin would probably take that. But if we add India, China, or Brazil peacekeeping force, this still can be done very quickly. So I think that China's involvement is crucial and very important. Like President Trump said in Davos, that on those issues, China can play a significant role there.
Anton Fedyashin, the new United States Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, he made some comments earlier this week ruling out membership of NATO for Ukraine. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops.
So, Anton, I guess there's two ways of looking at this. One is Hegseth's being very realistic there and saying, look, this is off the table during our negotiations. The other way of looking at it is something that Pieter Cleppe mentioned earlier on, is you're making a major concession even before the negotiations start. I mean, how big a stumbling block is NATO going to be in resolving this?
The Russians weren't going to agree to Ukraine's membership in NATO, one, so no one's giving anything up. This was dead on arrival. That's number one. Number two, if NATO wanted to bring Ukraine into its ranks, it's had at least two opportunities to do so since the beginning of the war. At the summit here in Washington for the 75th anniversary, and then in Vilnius the year before, in 2023, and it hasn't done so. So once again, what Hegseth is actually articulating is simply the realization of how reality works. Now, the presence of NATO country troops in Ukraine is a different issue, and this the Russians have also ruled out, and so has Hegseth, because non-U.S. Troops means that no Europeans who will be in Ukraine will enjoy any kind of American support, even if they are attacked, and that means that they will simply not risk placing their troops there. Non-European, non-NATO troops, that's a possibility, but that depends on whether the Russians settle on the question of peacekeepers at all, and that's also an open question. All of this will be decided during negotiations. I think the most important thing to note here is that, unfortunately for the Ukrainians and for the EU, which doesn't sound like it wants a negotiated settlement yet, the Russians are in the driving seat because they are winning the war on the ground. And I don't see any chance for the Ukrainians to reverse this. All of this, what is happening now, should have started much earlier. And it did, as a matter of fact, in Belarus first and then in Istanbul in March of 2024. And the Ukrainians, with the encouragement of the Americans and the British, walked away from those negotiations. And unfortunately, they are about to reap a very bitter harvest.
Pieter Cleppe, I want to get to something you mentioned earlier about Europe taking responsibility for its own security. President Trump has been very harsh in his criticism of Europe. He's been putting serious pressure on the Europeans to pay for their own security. In fact, his vice president, J.D. Vance, did make a speech in Munich in which one of the headlines from that speech was "Vance slams European allies at Munich conference." How concerned are the Europeans about this transatlantic relationship?
Well, when you're talking about defense, this is basically something that consecutive American presidents have been telling European governments to take their defense serious. Western Germany was spending 3 to 4% of its GDP on defense back in the 1960s. This has been halved, so they've been neglecting their defense. Same with Benelux, Sweden. Finland has, of course, been more responsible, Poland as well. So I think in that sense, European governments now, they agree with Trump that they They have been neglecting this, and I do think there's a political consensus to finally take defense serious. When you're talking about the speech of J.D. Vance in Munich, this was actually unrelated to security. He was talking about the values behind the transatlantic bond. He was saying, look, I mean, we're a defense, we have a defense community, but I mean, you are departing from our common values of free speech. And I do think he has a point. You know, the reaction of European governments towards sort of the loss of the influence of state media over society is to roll out all kinds of regulations like the Digital Services Act to try to control social media. And that's worrying, I think, yeah.
Pieter Kuznick, are we seeing a major shift in the transatlantic relationship? I mean, the United States has had this historic role, well, after World War II, that it was Europe's protector, but is that now changing?
It's very definitely changing, but it could change back again in 4 years. That's part of the problem that the world sees right now, that the United States flip-flops so frequently in terms of its policies that the United States is hard to trust as a partner, which is more incentive for the Europeans to be able to defend themselves and to become more independent from the United States. As the new polling that just came out this week shows, most Europeans don't see the U.S. as an ally, see it as a necessary associate, really, at this point. So that's changing. But the U.S. is becoming much more isolationist. And when the United States talks about America first, we got an interesting response to this from Foreign Minister Lavrov this week, who said America first is equal to the Hitler talking about Deutschland über alles.
Yeah.
This is not the approach that they wanted to see. But what now, the United States is no longer looking to these kinds of alliances, and the U.S. has different priorities. But even the discussion of using force against Greenland, against Panama, the U.S. approach toward with the tariffs against our friends and former allies, you know, the United States this is a very different United States than the United States under Biden.
Right.
And in some ways, Biden's approach in the Pacific and in Europe and even in the Middle East was a very militarized one.
Yeah.
Trump does not like wars. He does not like military involvements. He likes economic warfare.
Yeah.
He likes a different kind of bullying. And I think the Europeans are going to, in some ways, suffer from that, but in other ways, they'll be strengthened.
Wang Huiyao, talking about economic warfare, China is also concerned about economic tensions in the world right now. These are driven mainly by, protectionist policies, by trade barriers going up, by the imposition of tariffs, mainly by the United States. And all these issues are inherently tied to the national security of all these countries. I mean, to what extent can these trade wars undermine security?
Well, I think that's actually crucial. Actually, we are not talking too much about national security sometimes, but really we should really focus more on human security. As you mentioned, like trade, economic security, climate security, AI security, energy security, and so on. There are so many things that we need to work on, and trade is the key among all those things. That we have to flow the goods as normal as possible. So I think in the short term, Trump administration may gain a bit of this tariff war, trade war he's launching, but in the long run, actually this is going to push all the balance of the world trade more together. As I said, China is already the largest trading partner with 140 countries. There will be even trade more. But on the one hand, while Trump is raising tariff, China is lowering its tariff. China has actually set a zero tariff to 40 least developing countries that China just recently announced that.
Right.
So actually, there's a great difference there. But I think in the end that this economic concentration and talk more about economic development and healthy economic competition may also probably prove to be productive in the long run, rather than democracy versus democracy. I think Trump is less ideological, and that is great. I mean, let's do more on the economic and talk about the substance issues that are going to affect the daily lives of all the citizens in this world. So I really think that we need to have an equal and according to the international WTO rule and then really do this trade among the nations.
Okay, Anton Fedyashin, another major international issue is, of course, what's happening in Gaza. You know, what a UN court has called a plausible genocide. What lies ahead for the Palestinians after that announcement by President Trump that he wants the United States to take over there? And I'm wondering mainly internationally, what kind of precedent does something like that set?
A very bad one, and I think a chill went down everyone's spines when Trump proposed developing Gaza. I don't know of a single foreign state that has supported this, except for Israel, of course, although even there, not everyone, and not openly. I think the Gaza caper was one of Trump's sort of favored moves of throwing a rhetorical grenade into a problem and then seeing what comes out of the explosion when the dust settles. If he means it, I don't see how he could possibly pull it off, because international law simply not allow it. But if this is a segue to cut the Gordian knot and try to solve the Palestinian problem with a two-state solution, maybe it'll just that Trump has surrounded himself with people.
Okay, we've lost.
Solution as a viable.
Okay, let me go to Pieter Cleppe very quickly. Pieter Cleppe, I've just got less than half a minute, but how are the Europeans viewing this Trump plan?
For Gaza?
For Gaza, yes.
Oh, there's no support for this whatsoever. Also, I think there's the reality that, rightly or wrongly, Jordan and Egypt do not want to engage there. Egypt wants to keep the fence with Gaza. So I think it's going to be Israel's problem to solve.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for another edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
You might think you are better informed in an information age. The fact is, people are more often misled by misinformation. You might think every voice is heard in a digital world. The fact is, many nations and peoples are still underrepresented. And data poverty shuts out many. We at CGTN are committed to transcending the information gap and the digital divide. CGTN, bridging nations and civilizations. CGTN, see the difference.